It came in great rolling walls, sweeping dust and dried grass across the open land, as if trying to erase everything that dared to stand upon it. And a leaner marsh, thin as a winter branch, her boots held together with strips of torn petticoat, stood at the edge of a rutted trail and wondered if the wind might erase her too. She did not think that would be the worst thing. It had been 11 days since the wagon had broken down outside of Fort Laramie. 11 days since the last of the other settlers had pressed on without her, unwilling to wait while she buried her husband in the hard, unyielding earth. Thomas had gone from a cough to a rattling silence in less than a week, leaving her with an empty wagon, a mule that had since wandered off into the dark, and 43 cents wrapped in a handkerchief she kept tucked inside her dress. She had been a wife, then she had been a widow. Now she was not sure what word applied to what she was. She walked because stopping felt like dying. She followed the trail west because west was the direction Thomas had pointed when he still had breath enough to point. She ate what she could find: sparse winter berries, creek water, once a handful of dried corn she had discovered wedged in a crack of the wagon's floorboard, which she had picked out grain by grain like it was gold. The Badlands stretched around her in their eerie, broken beauty. Great formations of pale stone rose from the earth like the ruins of some ancient and forgotten city. The sky above them was enormous and indifferent. Eleanor had grown up in Ohio, where the trees crowded close enough to make the world feel manageable. Out here, the world was so large it made a person feel like a mistake. She crested a low ridge as the sun began its descent, painting everything amber and rose, and that was when she heard it. A child's cry. Thin, desperate, cutting through the wind like a needle. Eleanor stopped walking. Every sensible thought she possessed told her to keep moving. She had no food to share, no medicine, barely the strength to keep her own body upright. Whatever lay at the bottom of that ridge was not her concern. She was a woman alone in the wilderness, and a woman alone in the wilderness could not afford to follow the sound of a child crying. She was already moving toward it before the argument in her head had finished. The Lakota camp was small, a winter camp, she realized, reduced to perhaps a dozen lodges set close together in the shelter of a rocky outcropping. She approached slowly, hands raised, heart hammering so loudly she could hear it. She had heard stories about the Lakota. Thomas had heard stories too, and he had told them to her on the long nights of their crossing. Stories passed from one frightened settler to the next until they barely resembled whatever truth had started them. But the child was still crying. A woman emerged from the nearest lodge and saw Eleanor and went very still. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and dark, assessing eyes. She did not reach for anything. She simply looked. Eleanor pointed in the direction of the crying. "A child," she said, knowing the word was useless. "Is there a child sick?" The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and held open the entrance to the lodge. Inside, the air was warm and smoke-hazed and smelled of burning sage, and something else beneath it, the particular sharp sweetness of a fever sweating through skin. Eleanor's mother had been a healer of sorts, the woman neighbors called when the doctor was too far or too expensive. Eleanor had sat beside sickbeds since she was small enough to sit on a stool. She recognized what she was looking at immediately. The boy was perhaps 7 years old, small and slight, his face flushed deep red against the sleeping robes. His breath came in short, labored pulls, and when he exhaled, there was a sound in it, a wet, heavy sound that Eleanor knew meant the fever had settled into his chest. Kneeling beside him was a man. He was large, broad-shouldered, and still, his dark hair loose around his face, wearing a blanket across his shoulders as though he had been there long enough that the cold no longer registered. He looked up when Eleanor entered, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had been awake for a very long time, hollowed out with something that was not quite fear but lived beside it. Eleanor later learned that his name was Chayton, that he was the chief of this small winter band, that the boy burning with fever was his only son, his 7-year-old Tokala, who had been ill for 5 days and growing worse with each sunrise. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was the child. What she knew was the fever. She turned to the older woman who had followed her inside and mimed water, cupped hands, drinking. The woman left. Eleanor pulled off her outer coat and knelt on the other side of the boy from the man who watched her with those carved, exhausted eyes. "I'm going to help him," she said. She did not know if he understood her. She said it anyway. "I know how to bring a fever down." Eleanor's mother had called it the old knowledge. The kind passed hand to hand, woman to woman, learned not from books but from watching and doing and being trusted with something fragile. You kept the body cool but not cold. You kept the child moving between waking and sleep, so the fever could not grip too deep. You watched the breath, always the breath, because the breath told you everything the body was too proud to say outright. The older woman Eleanor would learn her name was Winona. Chayton's mother returned with water in a clay vessel. Eleanor tore a strip from her petticoat, already ragged at the hem, and soaked it and pressed it to the boy's forehead, his throat, his wrists. She worked steadily, without drama, replacing the cloth each time it warmed against his skin. Chayton did not move. He watched. Eleanor had been watched by men her whole life, watched and found wanting, or watched and found useful, which were not so different as people liked to pretend. Thomas had been a decent man, a kind man in his quiet way, but even he had watched her sometimes as though she were a piece of land he was trying to decide whether to farm. She had grown used to being looked at without being seen. This was different. Chayton watched the way a man watches something he is trying to understand rather than something he is trying to claim. It made her uncomfortable in a way she could not name, so she focused on the boy and kept her hands busy. Tokala stirred once in the first hour, his eyes fluttering open. They were his father's eyes, dark and serious, too old for his face. He looked at Eleanor with a kind of wondering confusion, this pale woman pressing cold cloth to his skin, and said something in Lakota that she did not understand. "I know," she said softly. "I know it hurts, but you're going to be all right." She did not know that he would be. She did not make promises she could not keep as a rule. But the words came out of her the way they had come out of her mother, automatically, a reflex of tenderness, something the body did when it sat beside a suffering child regardless of what the mind knew or didn't know. Tokala closed his eyes again. Chayton said something low and quiet. Winona answered him. Eleanor kept working. Sometime past midnight, she became aware that she was shaking. She had not eaten in 2 days. Not properly, not more than a few swallows of creek water and a handful of dried berries that had done nothing except remind her stomach of what it was missing. The warmth of the lodge, after the brutal cold outside, had been almost dizzying when she entered. Now, hours into her vigil, her body had begun to present its bill. She gripped the edge of the sleeping robe and breathed through it, focusing on Tokala's face. His color had changed. The angry red had softened slightly, become less alarming. His breathing was still labored but steadier. She thought the fever might have peaked. She thought it. She did not let herself believe it yet. A bowl appeared in her peripheral vision. She looked up. Chayton was holding it out to her. Something steaming, broth of some kind, smelling of meat, and something herbal she couldn't identify. He held it with both hands, formally, the way you hold something you are offering rather than something you are simply passing. She almost refused. She had been trained since childhood to refuse things from strangers, especially men, especially when she could not imagine what the price might be. The refusal was halfway to her mouth before she stopped it. He was offering her food. She was shaking from hunger. His son was lying between them. There was nothing to calculate here. She took the bowl. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He did not look away. The broth was warm and rich and tasted like the first real thing she had put in her body in longer than she could clearly remember. She drank it slowly, cupping the bowl in both hands, feeling the warmth of it move through her chest. When she finished, she set the bowl down carefully and turned back to Tokala. Chaitin spoke. She looked at him. He touched his own chest. Chaitin, he said. She understood. She touched her own chest. Eleanor. He repeated it, not perfectly, but close. Eleanor. She had not heard her own name spoken aloud since the last settler had pressed on without her, calling back over his shoulder something that might have been a farewell. She turned back to the boy and kept working. But something in her chest had shifted, some small stone moving from one place to another, and she could feel the gap it left behind. The fever broke near dawn. Eleanor knew at the moment she pressed her palm to Tokala's forehead and felt the change, the heat still there, but no longer raging, pulling back like a tide. His breathing had eased during the night, the wet sound in it diminishing hour by hour until by the time gray light began to show at the smoke hole of the lodge, she could hear him simply breathing, in and out, easy and even. She sat back on her heels and allowed herself, quietly and without expression, to feel the relief of it. Chaitin had remained awake beside her the entire night. He had not slept, not that she saw. He had kept the fire built up and replaced her cloth when she was slow about it, and sat with the particular stillness of a man who has decided that stillness is the only thing he can offer. Once, around the third hour of the night, Tokala had cried out in his sleep, and Chaitin had spoken to him in a low, continuous murmur until the boy quieted again. Not a song exactly, but rhythmic, steady, the sound of a voice a child's body knew. Eleanor had kept her eyes on her work, but she had listened. When the light changed, Chaitin leaned forward and looked at his son's face the way a man looks at something he thought he might lose. Then he looked at Eleanor. She did not know enough of his language to tell him that the boy still needed watching, that the fever could return, that the next 2 days would be important. She did what she could with her hands, held up 2 fingers, pointed at Tokala, pointed at herself. 2 days, I'll stay. She was not sure why she offered that. She had nowhere to be, which was true but insufficient as an explanation. Something else had been operative in the offer, something she did not examine closely. Chaitin spoke to his mother, who had come back into the lodge as the light changed. Winona looked at Eleanor for a long moment with those assessing dark eyes, then gave a single nod. They gave her a sleeping robe and a place near the fire. Eleanor had not slept under anything warmer than her own coat in 11 days. The robe was thick and soft and smelled of wood smoke and something clean. She lay down fully intending to stay only half asleep, alert for any change in Tokala, and was unconscious within minutes. She dreamed of Ohio, of her mother's kitchen, of a table with food on it and the sound of someone moving about nearby, ordinary and unhurried, the sound of a life that contained other people. When she woke, it was past midday. Tokala was sitting up. He was not well, his face was still pale, and his eyes had the glassy look of a fever that had burned but not entirely gone. But he was upright, and he was watching her with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend he isn't looking. Eleanor sat up. She pushed her hair back from her face. She was aware that she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had walked 11 days across the Badlands and then spent a night awake beside a sickbed. Tokala said something, pointed at her hair, which was pale brown and considerably disheveled. Despite herself, Eleanor almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "I know it's terrible." He said something else. She had no idea what. He seemed undiscouraged by this and continued, gesturing at her, at himself, at the lodge in general, with the conversational confidence of a child who has not yet registered that there might be a language barrier. "I don't understand you," she told him, "but I agree with whatever you're saying." This, for some reason, made him laugh, a real laugh, bright and sudden, startling in a child who had been burning with fever 8 hours ago. Eleanor felt something in her chest do a strange, lurching thing. She had not heard a child laugh in a very long time. Chayton returned to the lodge at dusk. He stopped in the entrance and looked at his son sitting upright, color returning to his face, eating a small amount of food his grandmother had brought. He stood very still for a moment, and Alina, who was sitting across the fire repairing a tear in her boot with a strip of leather Winona had given her, looked up and caught his face before he had arranged it into anything else. She looked away quickly, back to her boot. Some things were not meant to be witnessed. He crossed the lodge and sat beside Tokala and touched his face with one hand. Tokala said something emphatic and pointed at Alina. Chayton looked at her. "He's telling you something about me," Alina said, not looking up from the boot. Chayton said something to his son. Then, to Alina, "He says you talk to him even when he cannot understand you. He says it helped." Alina looked up. His English was accented and deliberate, chosen carefully, as though he kept it somewhere separate and had to retrieve it one word at a time. She had not known he had any. "I didn't realize you spoke English," she said. "Some, enough." A pause. "I learned from the traders and a missionary when I was young." Something in his expression suggested the memory of the missionary was not entirely fond. "I did not speak it last night. I was not sure I should." "Why not?" He considered this. "I was watching," he said finally, "to see what you would do when you thought I could not understand." Alina looked at him steadily, and, "You spoke to my son as though his comfort mattered." He said it plainly, without embellishment, as though it were a fact he was reporting. Some people do not do that with a child who cannot understand them. Alina looked back at her boot. Her throat felt peculiar. "My mother taught me that kindness doesn't need translation," she said. I'm not sure she meant it literally, but apparently it applies. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. The fire burned. Tokala, exhausted from his brief exertion, had slumped against his father's side and was already sliding back toward sleep. Chayton sat with one hand resting on his son's back, the automatic gesture of a parent keeping count of breaths. Alina kept her eyes on her work, but she was aware, acutely, strangely aware of being in a warm place, with the sound of other people breathing around her, and the awareness sat in her chest like a coal that had not yet decided whether to burn or simply to glow. On the second morning, Winona taught her to make the broth. It was not requested and not exactly offered. Winona simply appeared beside Alina with a clay pot and various dried things, and began demonstrating with the efficient authority of a woman who has decided to teach whether or not her student has agreed to learn. Alina paid attention. She had always paid attention when someone with knowledge was willing to share it. It was one of the few instincts her upbringing had given her that she was purely grateful for. The dried plants were ones she didn't recognize, not the herbs she knew from Ohio, not the remedies her mother had grown in her kitchen garden. But the principles were the same. Roots for strength, certain leaves for the fever heat, bark scraped fine for the chest. Winona showed her how to judge the amount by touch and smell rather than measurement, and Alina's hands learned it the way hands learn things, not through understanding but through repetition. Tokala sat nearby, bundled in robes, watching them with proprietary interest. He had appointed himself Alina's guide to things he felt she was handling incorrectly, which was most things, communicated through a combination of pointing and expression that required no translation whatsoever. "He's very opinionated," Alina said. Winona, who had approximately 30 words of English deployed very selectively, said, "His father." Alina pressed her lips together to keep from smiling too openly. She had not let herself think about what came next. She was practiced at this, at keeping her attention on the immediate task and not looking at the horizon. It had gotten her through Thomas's illness, through the burial, through the 11 days of walking. If she looked at the horizon, she saw the shape of her situation with perfect clarity. A woman alone, with no money, no food, no shelter, no destination, in the middle of winter, in a landscape that had no particular interest in keeping her alive. She had a day, perhaps two, before Chaitin's hospitality reached its natural end, and she would need to walk back out into the cold. She was sitting with this thought, quietly, outside the lodge in the thin winter sunlight while Tokala napped inside, when Chaitin appeared and sat beside her. He was quiet for a moment. He did this, she had noticed, sat with a silence long enough to make sure it was the right time before he put words into it. "Where were you going?" he asked. "Before." "West," she said. "Oregon eventually. My husband had the plan. I had the habit of following it." "And now?" She looked at the pale stone formations in the distance. "Now I have neither a husband nor a plan." He was quiet again. "Then you could stay." Elena turned and looked at him. He met her eyes without discomfort. "Through the winter, we are a small band. We lost people last year. There is work that needs doing and you have useful knowledge." A pause. "My mother has decided she wants to teach you things. When she decides to teach someone, it is easier not to argue." "I noticed," Elena said. "And Tokala." He said his son's name with a particular weight, not heavy but deliberate, the way you say the name of something important. "He asks about you. This morning he asked me 14 questions about your hair." Elena looked down at her hands. They were clasped in her lap, chapped from the cold and the wet cloth of 2 nights ago. The knuckles reddened. They were not the hands she'd had in Ohio. They were something harder. "I don't want charity," she said. "It is not charity. We need a healer. You need shelter." He paused. "A trade is not charity." "And in spring?" He was quiet for a moment. "In spring we will discuss spring." Elena considered the stone formations. She considered the wagon trail behind her and the 43 cents in her handkerchief and the flat arithmetic of her options. She considered Tokala's laugh, that sudden, bright sound, and Winona's hands showing her the herbs by feel, and the broth warm in her palms in the middle of the night when she had been shaking. She thought about what Thomas would have said. Thomas, who was a decent man, would have been frightened. He would have made the decision out of fear and called it reason. Elena had been making decisions out of fear her entire life. She was tired of it. "Through the winter," she said. "Through the winter," Chaitin agreed. The wind moved across the pale stone. Somewhere in the lodge behind them, Tokala made a small sound in his sleep and settled. Winona's voice answered him, low and automatic, the reflex of a woman who has been answering children in the night for 40 years. Elena sat in the thin winter sunlight and felt, for the first time in longer than she could account for, that she was not standing outside of something. That she was. Provisionally and carefully, and without any promises beyond the next season, inside. It was a small thing. It was also the largest thing she had felt in years. She did not say any of that. She simply sat, and the wind moved, and the camp went about its life around her, unhurried, including her without requiring her to explain herself.